So it's my last day on my big tour of America and flying home from the US to England tomorrow morning. At the time of filming, it's 8:30 US time, it's 1:30 time in the UK. So this will probably be uploaded something like 3 a.m. UK time. Appreciate people probably won't pick it up till the next day. But yeah, hopefully flying home tomorrow, and I'm kind of in one of these, like the airport hotels that you get sometimes where you're kind of a little bit in the middle of nowhere, and I'm just got some time to kill really before we're good to fly home tomorrow. So thought we would do a little bit of a video. Thought we would. I was actually on a little connecting flight today. And I was coming up with some topics. Wanted to discuss Dillian Whyte versus Robert Helenius, which has been announced. Lamont Peterson versus Errol Spence. Maybe a bit of Kevin Johnson. We'll get there. Robert Helenius versus Dillian Whyte has actually had a bit of a mixed response. And to be honest, I actually think it's had a bit of an unfair response. I've seen people online saying, can't be bothered with this fight, can't believe it's the co-main event of a pay-per-view. Robert Helenius is a sort fighter. Dillian Whyte's going to handle him with consummate ease. This is a crap fight. I actually think it's a pretty good fight. I think it's a particularly good fight if you consider that it was 2 weeks' notice. Regular viewers will know I did a video 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago now. And it was called something like, I don't have it in front of me, but it was called something like Robert Helenius is sparring with Anthony Joshua, potentially ahead of a Dillian Whyte fight. And, I guess if you throw enough darts at the board, one of them's eventually going to hit the bullseye. But, in that video, I actually called one correctly for once and said that I think that Robert Helenius is prepping for a fight with Dillian Whyte. And that's the fight that's been made. And let me say, 2 weeks out from the fight, I think we could have had a hell of a lot worse opponent than Robert Helenius, who, for me, is something of a credible name and still a contender in the division. I've not got any time constraints tonight, so we might do a bit more of a long, rambling one. I know some people like those, some people don't, so let's get there. But when I started covering boxing on YouTube, I think I set up this YouTube channel in like 2013, and I think I did about 20 videos, didn't do anything for about a year, and then started again in earnest like 2014, that sort of time. But when I started covering boxing on YouTube, the heavyweight division was a very different landscape. This was prior to Anthony Joshua, this was prior to Deontay Wilder being a big name, this was prior to Joseph Parker. It was a lot weaker division, and at the time, I remember this vividly, and long time heavyweight boxing fans will remember this. At the time, Robert Helenius, back sort of 2012, 2013, was being considered like a real contender in the heavyweight division, a real future star, if you like. And he was a real hype prospect in that sort of European circuit. They spent a lot of money on him on the way up, and they got in some of the sort of big name opponents, sort of guys who were past it, guys who weren't necessarily tough work for Helenius, but guys who had some name value. So, for example, in 2010, they brought in Lamont for him. In 2010 also, he fought a then undefeated Gregory Toney. 2011, he fought Sam Peter. 2011, he fought former world champion Serhij Lajkovic. He fought Michael Sprott, Sherman Williams. In 2011, he fought and controversially defeated Derek Chisora. See what I mean? Like he was one of these guys who, I'm not saying he was beating the best opposition in the world, but he was beating named opposition. And opposition like Lamont Brewster, opposition like Sam Peter, at that stage of their careers, maybe they weren't the best opponents in the world, but they were still expensive opponents to bring in compared to heavyweights of similar quality without that celebrity. So he was a hyped prospect, and people were very excited about him. It may surprise people to know that in Robert Helenius' native Finland, he's something of a pay-per-view star. When he fought Johan de Par, I believe when he fought Franz Rill, these were arena fights that they sold a lot of tickets for. I believe I'm correct in saying these fights were pay-per-view fights, and Helenius was actually something of a pay-per-view attraction in his native country. Um, so he was a guy who was very highly touted. He was a very, very big heavyweight. He's listed on BoxRec as 6'6". I think he's bigger than that. I think he's 6'7", 6'8", and he was knocking people out. His knockout ratio isn't exceptional. He's knocked out 16 from 25 wins, but he was known as something of a real puncher, and he was someone who was, talked about as moving towards world title level. As you guys know, he suffered an injury in that controversial Derek Chisora fight. I believe he had some promotional issues since, and then he was sort of plagued with inactivity, time out of the ring for one reason or another, and his career kind of stalled ahead of a unfortunate and unexpected knockout defeat to Johan de Par in 2016. Subsequent to that, he's come back. He's had 3 wins, all ending in stoppage against Konstantin Eriks, Gonzalo Basil, and Evgeny Orlov. So sort of recognised upper journeyman, lower gatekeeper type standard. And now he's back into a big fight with Dillian Whyte. Let me say something, and this might surprise a few people given some of the criticism that this fight's got. I think there's an argument that if Dillian Whyte beats Robert Helenius, it's the biggest win of Dillian Whyte's career. Look, Helenius isn't the best fighter in the world. He's looking more fragile. He isn't going to be a world champion. But if we look at Dillian Whyte's resume, has he actually beaten anyone better than Robert Helenius? The only conceivable argument you could make is Derek Chisora. But let's be honest, when Chisora and Helenius fought, even though people think Chisora won that fight, there wasn't too much in it. It was a relatively competitive matchup. So what I'm getting at is, as Dillian Whyte's resume goes, obviously he had the Joshua fight he was unsuccessful in, but in terms of his wins, if he were to defeat Helenius, it would actually be one of the bigger wins on his resume. And I also think it would be very good experience against a very, very tall, big opponent. If you look at Whyte's big wins, guys like Chisora, guys like Dave Allen, guys like Ian Lewison, they're kind of shorter heavyweights. If you want to be conquering the heavyweight division, if Dillian Whyte is serious about having world title fights and winning titles, he may have to be fighting the taller guys, the Wilders, the Joshuas, the Klitschko's, the Furies, like those kind of names. So a guy like Robert Helenius will at least give him an insight into that. And, in actual fact, you can see why Joshua's been sparring him ahead of a fight with Kubrat Pulev, because he does have that classic European style. I'm not saying he's as good as a Klitschko or as good as a Pulev even, but he's got that sort of style, if you like, of working off the jab, looking to throw the straight 1-2, being tall and long and looking to use distance. And, I can see him being valuable sparring and a valuable learning experience for Dillian Whyte in this fight. Having seen some of Helenius' recent outings, for me, he's slowed a bit. He is heavy-handed, but I think he's one of these fighters who carries a bit of a threat in the first couple of rounds. He's almost, you see the power starting to drain out of his work after the first 3 or 4 rounds, and you wonder, he's 33 years old, so he's not old, but you just wonder if he's maybe had his peak. You just wonder if he's a bit big and a bit heavy and a bit lacking in activity and athleticism, and after sort of 4 or 5 rounds, potentially he slows, and it's more a case, certainly in fights that I've seen of him recently, it's kind of more a case that after 3 or 4 rounds, when he's dangerous, he more sort of follows opponents around the rings, throwing a sort of slow jab and just trying to control the fight at a sort of slow pace from distance and that sort of thing, really. He's not at this stage the most athletic, the fastest, the most dynamic, the best combination puncher. He's certainly not the most versatile of fighters. He's not going to be throwing electric combinations on the inside. He's not going to be throwing wild hooks and uppercuts. But he does carry something of a threat in the first few rounds, and he isn't a terrible fighter. As I say, I think there's a strong argument to make that this will actually be the biggest win of Dillian Whyte's career to date, which, for me is a reason to support the fight, given that it was made at at 2 weeks' notice. As for Dillian Whyte, he's someone who I like. I like him as a personality. I think he's entertaining, and I think he always brings a good fight. But where this idea that Dillian Whyte is just going to absolutely smash through a guy like Robert Helenius has come from, I'm not sure. I mean, I think Dillian Whyte does deserve to be a favourite in this fight. He's the younger guy, he's the home fighter, he's the guy with the more momentum, etc. But, you know, let's be honest, Dillian Whyte has gone life or death with Derek Chisora. Dillian Whyte has been made to look pretty poor by the likes of Ian Lewison and, you know, even David Allen to an extent in their fights. And, you know, people talk about the Dillian Whyte power. I know he's got knockouts at a lower level, and I know he's knocked out some tall opponents at a lower level, the likes of a Nascimento, for example. But where are these knockouts of top 50 heavyweights? You know, he didn't knock out Ian Lewison, he didn't knock out David Allen. These guys aren't even fighting at British title level yet. I'm not saying Dillian Whyte isn't a hurtful puncher. I'm sure he is. And look, Johan de Par knocked out Robert Helenius, and Johan de Par is certainly not the biggest puncher in the world. So I'm not saying Dillian Whyte can't win this fight by stoppage, but it does surprise me when I see people on Twitter saying this is easy work for Dillian Whyte, and, you know, Robert Helenius has nothing left, Dillian Whyte should blast him out there. I wonder if the Dillian Whyte power is ever so slightly overhyped. And I also wonder if the Dillian Whyte chin is potentially overhyped. You know, Dillian Whyte is regarded as having a very, very good chin because of how much punishment that he stood up against from Anthony Joshua. But I always found that strange, because people say Klitschko has a very bad chin, yet Klitschko went a lot deeper into the fight than Dillian Whyte did, and, you know, Dillian Whyte was actually rattled and looked like he could be stopped in the very first round of that Joshua fight. So yes, Dillian Whyte's a tough man, yes, he's got a great heart, and he's clearly got a level of punch resistance, but does he have this iron jaw? You know, I'm not so sure. He was badly knocked out by Anthony Joshua. I for one thought he was wobbled and hurt on one or two occasions in that Chisora fight. So, you know, Dillian Whyte, I just wonder, he's one of these guys who's, he comes across as a very, very hard man outside of the ring, and I'm sure he's extremely mentally tough, and I'm sure he is extremely hard. But, you know, we've discussed this in other videos previously. We discussed how hard Jamie Cox was, you know, and what happened to him. We discussed how hard Avni Yildirim was, and what happened to him. You know, toughness and being a hard, tough guy can only get you so far. And for me, I just wonder if Dillian Whyte's power and Dillian Whyte's chin has been slightly overstated by some of his fans in the lead up to this fight. Technically, I also think he's questionable. I think the construction of his punches is poor. I think the construction of his punches at times reminds me of a Derek Chisora. Notice how he kind of flails out that jab. He doesn't properly stick out the jab in what I would, you know, Dillian Whyte knows how to box far better than me, of course he does, but I question some of the construction of his punches and the way he actually throws his punches. And, you know, from a sort of pure ABC perspective, I actually think you could make an argument that Robert Helenius has several technical advantages in this fight. I think the construction of some of Helenius's punches is arguably better, especially his jab. So I think it's an interesting fight, and it's a fight that I do make Dillian Whyte a favourite, and don't get me mistaken, but it's a fight that I do see as very competitive, and I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know how many rounds it's over. Let me see if it's for some sort of title. It's for the vacant WBC silver title, so I'm presuming that means it's over 12, you know. Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Robert Helenius either sprung the upset or drew Whyte very, very close here. You know, I don't think this is easy work whatsoever. I think it's actually an intriguing fight, and that's why I'm spending so long talking about it. I mean, we wouldn't normally do 20 minutes or 25 minutes on Dillian Whyte, Robert Helenius, but we're going to do it tonight because, as I say, I'm sat in an airport hotel room with not much else on my mind, so we're going to do it. And we're going to talk about a fight of this magnitude in far more detail than I'm sure anyone else is doing on YouTube, because they're probably got far better things to do with their time than I do tonight. But yeah, a lot of the advantages here for Robert Helenius. You know, Helenius has had, I think he's arguably, I think their resumes are similar, but I think you could argue that Robert Helenius has got a marginally superior resume, certainly similar. He's got an advantage in terms of height, which is something that I think could be a problem for Dillian Whyte. I don't think the power is dissimilar. I do think Helenius has enough power to buzz Dillian Whyte if he catches him. I believe Helenius would have more power than the Chisora, for example, and I think he buzzed Dillian Whyte. And I think if Helenius can get that jab going, he can actually keep Dillian Whyte at bay for a bit, because but we'll see. We'll see how much desire Helenius has got left. We'll also see what kind of shape he's in. I mean, yes, he's coming in at 2 weeks' notice, having been inactive, which doesn't bode well. But at the same time, we know he's been sparring Anthony Joshua, and we know that this fight has potentially been being discussed for 3 or 4 weeks. So I don't think this is equivalent to some guy sitting in a pub getting a phone call saying he needs to fight in 2 weeks. I think this is, I think Robert Helenius is hopefully in a bit more better place than just having 2 weeks' notice from Stretz. If this is a 12-round fight and Whyte's been in camp for 2 or 3 months, that could be a pivotal factor in this fight, and could mean that going down the stretch, when you get to the championship rounds, Whyte is coming on the stronger of the two, especially given how big and inactive Helenius has been. But I think this is interesting. I think it's arguably going to be, whoever wins the fight, I think it would be Helenius' best win. I think it would possibly be Whyte's best win. I think that some of the questions surrounding these guys, are applicable to both. One thing I did speculate on is I sometimes wonder, when Anthony Joshua has these guys in for sparring, is he looking at them, or is Eddie Hearn looking at them, or Matchroom, or one of the extended team looking at them, and looking at that sparring to assess if they'd be a good opponent for one of the other heavyweight fighters? Let's be honest. When Joshua paid Helenius, I assume it was paid, to come over and spar, whether it's Joshua himself or whether it's someone from the Matchroom team, could have been having one eye on that sparring, trying to assess the shape of Robert Helenius, the class of Robert Helenius, and whether he's a beatable fighter for Dillian Whyte. I mean, if we're going conspiracy theories, Joshua himself probably has a vested interest in Dillian Whyte winning this fight. Dillian Whyte versus Joshua as a rematch would be, a huge fight. It would do huge numbers. Joshua could probably look at it as a relatively low-risk fight to earn 20-30 million off and sell out a big arena with. So Joshua's maybe got a vested interest in Dillian Whyte winning the fight from a business perspective. Maybe he's had a look at Helenius, or someone from Matchroom's had a look at Helenius and is saying, Helenius is a shot fighter, or Helenius isn't in very good shape at the minute. Let's get him in at late notice for Dillian. I don't know if that's the case, but I do know that in the past they've had guys like Leroy Thomas in for sparring, and then they've thought, okay, we've seen what Leroy Thomas is all about, let's stick him in with David Allen. So, maybe stuff like that's going on behind the scenes, and maybe the team behind know that Robert Helenius is overweight. Maybe they know he's looked lackluster in sparring with AJ. Maybe they've known that AJ's been able to hurt him or take him out. I don't have any perspective on what's going on behind the scenes. But I do think that is possibly something to consider in the lead up to this fight. All in all, I do think it's a good fight and competitive fight, as I say. Whyte, he's got the notice here. He's been the one in full training camp. He's the younger guy. He's the fresher guy. He's the guy with more momentum. He's the guy who's got the bigger carrot at the end of this. A loss to Helenius would be devastating for Dillian Whyte's career. Whyte's on the verge of some £1 million paydays, I'm sure, if he keeps winning, and a loss to Helenius would cripple that. So for Whyte, this is a can't lose fight, and for Helenius, there are some questions about what kind of condition he's in, what he's got left, what desire he's got. So you have to make Whyte a favourite based on that. What I will say is if a peak Robert Helenius turned up, the guy from 5, 6 years ago, I probably would pick him to beat Dillian Whyte by a narrow margin, because I do think Dillian Whyte, whilst he's an improving fighter, I do think he has technical weaknesses and deficiencies that could be exploited by a tall fighter with that European style. And I do think he's been somewhat overhyped, specifically in the power and chin department. So, let's just see. For me, it's one to keep an eye out on, and I don't actually understand the hate for this fight. Especially given the notice. I was thinking Helenius would be the opponent, but if it wasn't going to be Helenius and they were going to have to try and get someone in on 2 weeks' notice, I thought it could be, a guy like Malcolm Tan, who Dillian fought last time out, and this is a hell of a lot better fight for that than that. Let me tell you. So, there's my thoughts on that one. We kept it to 20 minutes on Whyte Helenius, but there you go. Another fight that interests me that I've seen announced is Lamont Peterson versus Errol Spence. Lamont Peterson's a fighter I actually quite enjoy watching. He is a guy who, for me, is a very, very versatile fighter. And when a fighter's so versatile, it adds an extra intrigue into what they're going to bring to the ring. It adds a certain unpredictability. Lamont Peterson, he isn't truly elite. He's not the biggest guy at 147. He's probably going to be small compared to Errol Spence. He isn't the biggest puncher in the world. We kind of know his limitations. But what we don't really know is what kind of style he can bring to the ring. Look at the contrast between his fights with Danny Garcia and Amir Khan. Against Amir Khan, he famously walked Amir Khan down, looked to trade with him, looked to get into Amir Khan's engine room and grind away inside the pocket, banking shots to the body and smothering and wearing down Amir Khan, who was heavily favoured in that fight. Against Danny Garcia, he was very elusive. He took up the mantle of a back foot slickster, dancing around the ring on the back foot, trying to make Garcia miss, trying to frustrate. He's a guy who can do different things and give different looks in the ring. And potentially he could be looking at that fight between Errol Spence and Kell Brook. And that fight's a divisive fight. You can look back at that fight and see different things. On one hand, you could say a guy like Errol Spence, who's untested at the time, went out and stopped a great champion in Kell Brook. In another light, you could say that Kell Brook was fundamentally outboxing Errol Spence from range until he got injured and fatigue caught up with him. So it depends how you look at it, but potentially Lamont Peterson could be looking at that fight, seeing some of the success that Kell Brook enjoyed from long range, and look and replicate that. Alternatively, he could be one of those guys who could look to mix it up with Errol Spence, try and fly into the eye of the storm like he did with Amir Khan, and serve it up to Errol Spence on the inside. My suggestion is that he's quite a calculated fighter with good people around him, and he's likely to try and keep the fight at range, because for me, Spence is a world-class fighter inside the pocket. There's still an open question about whether he's a world-class fighter when he's boxing long. Maybe Kell Brook is a truly elite fighter boxing long. I suspect that may well be the case, but some of those questions Kell Brook caused Errol Spence. You could see Lamont Peterson asking similar questions. Now, I would admit, Peterson doesn't have the size, doesn't have the power, the strength of a Kell Brook, so I suspect he will have less effect than Errol Spence. But he's not coming into the fight coming off the back of a Golovkin fight. He's not coming into the fight off the back of surgery, as I understand it. So, maybe Lamont Peterson isn't without any chance here. All in all, I think it's a fight that Errol Spence is a very, very strong favourite in. But it's not a bad first defence. And if you look at Errol Spence's resume, for me, this is significantly his second toughest opponent. Obviously Kell Brook was his toughest opponent in his career to date. I have Lamont Peterson as a far better fighter than the likes of a Bundu or an Algieri. So, I don't mind this fight. Again, it probably has received some criticism online. People wanting to see Errol Spence jump straight in with Keith Thurman or Terence Crawford or someone like that, someone in the elite names. Obviously, those would be extremely, extremely exciting matchups that would be 50-50 fights, very, very hard to call. I'd find it very hard to call, and let's hope one day those fights happen. But Errol Spence is a young guy, he's still on the way up, and he's just coming off a tough fight against Kell Brook. He's coming off the biggest fight in his career. Perhaps he does deserve a first defence at a good level, a top 10 level, but not quite an elite level. And I think Lamont Peterson will prove to be beatable for Spence, but will prove to be a decent test. Kevin Johnson, and I'm covering this from more of a comedy perspective as opposed to a boxing perspective. But Kevin Johnson, as you guys may know, is coming back off 2 straight knockout wins, knocking out former world title challenger Francisco Pianeta in Germany last night in a fight that Pianeta would have been heavily favoured to win. I haven't seen the fight, but by all accounts Kevin Johnson actually looked quite good. Dominated the fight, hurt Pianeta on several times and then knocked him out, which was a real turn up for the books. Fair play to Kevin Johnson, 41 years old, and Pianeta's a guy. I know Pianeta's had his losses to Chigaev and Klitschko, but on his day Pianeta isn't a bad fighter. He's certainly a top 30, top 40 heavyweight. He's that sort of bracket. He's got 1 or 2 decent bits of form back in the day. He beat Johan Depar, I think, when Depar was unbeaten. Pianeta isn't a terrible fighter by any stretch. So, as much as people will raise their eyebrows, Kevin Johnson is sort of back in the mix of the top 30, 35, 40 with his win over Pianeta. He hilariously is saying he's the hottest thing in the division, and even at 41 years old, he is calling out the rematch with Anthony Joshua. Being perfectly frank, Kevin Johnson's a clever man. I doubt he believes that's realistic. I mean, we know the criticism Eddie Hearn gets. Can you imagine what would go down on Twitter if Joshua Kevin Johnson, the rematch, was announced on Sky Sports box office? So I doubt that will be happening. But perhaps we will see Kevin Johnson utilised as a gatekeeper for some of the upcoming heavyweights. I mean, we've seen him in the Fast fight Tyson Fury, Derek Chisora, Anthony Joshua, obviously. Potentially guys like Hughie Fury, maybe a Daniel Dubois, maybe a Nathan Gorman, maybe even like a David Allen. Potentially Johnson would actually be a good test for these sort of guys, because he's a very awkward guy, lots of experience, incredibly durable, and whilst Joshua proved that if you are truly elite you can get him out of there, guys like Kubrat Pulev, guys like Christian Hamer, even guys like Tyson Fury and Derek Chisora struggled to get him out of there. So and failed to get him out of there, I should add. So don't be surprised if we do actually see Kevin Johnson in a big fight. And people may laugh, but I'm calling it now. We'll see Kevin Johnson in something of a big fight. The guy talks up a good game. He's a great talker. He's a real entertainer outside of the ring. And as much as he's disappointed on the big stage, he actually has 2 or 3 semi-credible wins to his resume. Alex Leopai, Pianeta now, etc. So the return of Kevin Johnson, leave me a comment, let me know what you think of that. Are you one of those people pining for the rematch with Joshua? Can Kevin Johnson reverse the form, or will AJ duck the rematch? It's funny. It's funny to see a guy like Kevin Johnson, how he kind of retires and then pops up, then retires and then pops up again. But Kevin Johnson's always been a good fighter. On his day, I don't think there's any of us out here who would say Kevin Johnson's a bad fighter, or Kevin Johnson lacks ability. He just doesn't seem to put it together on the big stage, and he seems all too happy to go into sparring partner mode and opponent mode. But that's why the win over Pianeta surprised me, because I've seen Kevin Johnson in fights where he really should have won. When he fought Christian Hamer, I thought he was clearly the better fighter out of the two, but he just kind of went in sparring partner mode. When he fought Derek Chisora, I thought he could have the beating of Chisora that night, but he just went in sparring partner mode. So interesting that he did a bit of a number on Pianeta. I'm not seriously speculating that he can do something in the division, but do not be surprised if he ends up in the ring with like a Dubois or something like that. And do not be surprised if he makes someone look bad, because I know Joshua destroyed him, but he's made a number of people look pretty average over the years, Kevin Johnson. And yeah, he's a guy who's not afraid of going the distance when he's getting a bit of a pounding. So there you go, guys. Covered a range of topics. Probably did the most in detail breakdown you're going to find anywhere in the world on Helenius versus Dillian Whyte. Talked a bit of Errol, Spence. Talked a bit of Kevin Johnson. So yeah, I think that's me out of boxing topics. One thing, I mean, let me ask you this. So my connecting flight today, right? I got priority boarding paid for by my work, right? And look, don't get me wrong. This was no first class lounge gig. It was a flight where they only had one class, and I think priority boarding was something like $12 or something like that. So I'm not suggesting that I'm living the high life, but I wanted to ask if anyone out there, and I know this is a strange question, if you're only here for the boxing, you need to have switched off 30 seconds ago, but out of interest, is there anyone here who has ever paid for priority boarding? And if so, why? Because I really cannot understand it. I view priority boarding as something of a negative. So, you know, it comes over the tannoy and they're like, right, your flight is ready to board. Could the A-list celebrities who've paid for priority boarding come forward to the front of the queue? So I'm standing there, you know, I'm getting like respect from the air hostess. You know, it's like, wow, this guy's a real deal. He's paid like $12 to get priority boarding. You know, me and my fellow priority boarders are kind of looking at the people waiting to board, you know, 10 minutes after us. But, you know, you then complete your priority boarding and you're sat on the airplane, which is, you know, I'm a bigger guy, I'm a taller guy, you got your no leg room at all, you're cramped in the airport for a lot longer, you're cramped in the aircraft for a lot longer. Sometimes these things take half an hour to load, you know, so it means you've got an extra half an hour sat there, you know, and then the people who haven't foregone their financials, you know, the people who haven't paid for it get an extra half an hour to sit in the lounge, which is a far more spacious environment when you're not crammed in with your knees up to your chin, and then they come in and sit next to you anyway. So I really do not understand the purpose of priority boarding, and I was wondering if someone could help solve this mystery for me, because I guess I've had very little to do today and it's been playing on my mind. But it strikes me that you're far better off not to have priority boarding, because it means you're in a cramped environment for far less time, and whilst you get the sort of recognition of being a wealthy person who's paid for priority boarding, look, maybe this trip to the States has driven me insane, I don't know. Like, I didn't think when I started this channel we'd be debating airline boarding procedure, but there you go. Anyway, guys, I'm out. When I start rambling about my flights, it's probably an indication that I've mumbled on for too long. But let me leave some comments, let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments on Dillian Whyte versus Helenius. Am I right? Is this potentially competitive? Is Robert Helenius being overlooked? Is this actually a good fight? Or if you're one of those who's critical of the fight, could you please explain why? I'd be interested to know. Do you disagree that this is actually not the biggest fight of Helenius' career? Sorry, of Dillian Whyte's career? You know, were you expecting a lot better on 2 weeks' notice? Or do you know something that I don't? Have you seen more of Helenius' recent performances, and does he just look absolutely woeful? But leave a comment, let me know. Errol, Spence, Lamont, Peterson, let me know your thoughts on that. How will it break down stylistically? Does Peterson pose any sort of a threat? Is it easy work for Errol Spence? Let me know about Kevin Johnson. Will you be paying pay-per-view to watch Kevin Johnson versus, I don't know, Hughie Fury, Daniel Dubois? One of these names. Let's see. And if you can solve my priority boarding riddle, do let me know. If you pay for it, and people do. You know, I only paid for it because my company had it. But Yeah, there were plenty of people there who paid for it. Just help me explain why. I'd be interested to know. Maybe you'll change my opinion. You know, I'm an open-minded guy. Drop your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, you haven't done so before for whatever reason, please do take the time to subscribe so you can check out all of my other stuff. Had a few new subscribers jump on recently. We're not a million miles off hitting the 6,000 subscribers mark, which would be a great target to hit. Hopefully we'll get there around the Joshua Pulev sort of time. So yeah, support the channel by hitting subscribe. Give me a follow on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. You can add me as a friend on Facebook on the link below. Thanks all. As always, appreciate you tuning in.